Since 2022, something has been broken between Burkina Faso and the African Union. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré took power in a military coup, the AU responded swiftly and harshly. They condemned the takeover, suspended Burkina Faso from the bloc, and effectively cut off all formal communication. For nearly 2 years, there was no diplomacy, no dialogue, just silence and sanctions. The African Union had turned its back. While Burkina Faso fought insurgency and rebuilt from the inside, the AU watched from a distance, seemingly uninterested in the realities on the ground. But recently, something unexpected happened. A shift, a sign of change. The new African Union chairman, Angolan President João Lourenço, broke that silence. For the first time in years, he sent a delegation to Ouagadougou, but this wasn't the usual political visit. It wasn't about pressure or punishment. This time, they came to listen. Antonio Tete, the special envoy sent by President Lourenço, arrived not with threats, but with questions. According to him, this was a listening mission, a chance to understand the reality inside Burkina Faso and across the broader Sahel region. No demands were made, no conditions were given, just a quiet mission to hear Traoré's side of the story. The question now is, why? What changed behind the scenes to prompt this visit? And why is the African Union finally paying attention? That's what we're about to uncover. Mr. Antonio Tete didn't just visit. He spoke with purpose. He made it clear that his mission was to listen to President Traoré, not to judge him. He wanted to understand the challenges facing not just Burkina Faso, but the entire Sahel region. In his own words, he came to see what collective paths we can take as Africans to find solutions to the challenges facing each region of our continent. But then, he said something even more revealing. Given the crisis in the Sahel, Mr. Tete emphasized that it is only natural that the African Union's principle of non-indifference should guide us to take an interest in what is happening throughout Africa. Let's pause here, because this statement changes everything. For years, the African Union stood by as the Sahel burned. Terrorist attacks, mass displacements, the collapse of rural governance. These headlines have dominated news platforms, both African and Western. Every day, we've seen stories of thousands killed, of entire towns abandoned, of chaos unfolding. And yet, the African Union said nothing, did nothing. No delegations, no official missions, just silence. So why now? Why, after years of ignoring the worsening situation, is the AU suddenly interested in listening to Burkina Faso? Could it be pressure from within Africa? A shift in regional power dynamics? Or is the AU trying to stay relevant as countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger form stronger independent alliances? There's more to this than meets the eye, and it raises one big question. Has the African Union finally woken up, or is this just damage control? Let's keep going. For years, Burkina Faso and its neighbors in the Sahel were left to fend for themselves. They pleaded for help. They raised the alarm, but no one came. Not from the African Union, not from ECOWAS. In desperation, they turned to France, hoping for support. But even that alliance would later come crashing down. And where was the African Union, the very body meant to stand for African unity and collective defense? Nowhere. The AU was silent during the worst moments of the Sahel crisis, silent while villages were attacked, silent while jihadist groups spread like wildfire, silent as Burkina Faso struggled under the weight of war and displacement. But the moment there was a coup, suddenly, the AU found its voice. Just like ECOWAS, the African Union didn't ask why the coup happened. It didn't send a fact-finding team. It didn't attempt dialogue. It simply condemned the action and suspended Burkina Faso from the bloc. And from that day until now, the AU remained disengaged, offering no support, no solidarity, no solutions. All while Burkina Faso faced not only internal war, but sanctions from both ECOWAS and the West. It was as if Burkina Faso had become invisible. But here's the truth that can't be ignored anymore. Just like ECOWAS, the African Union has become a puppet, a shadow of what it once claimed to be. Instead of acting in Africa's interest, it follows the lead of foreign powers. So why did they come now? Why send an envoy to Ouagadougou? Because they noticed something. The United States and other Western nations are quietly trying to rebuild ties with Burkina Faso. And when the AU saw that, it decided it was finally safe to re-engage. Not because they care, but because they don't want to be left behind. Isn't that pathetic? Let's go deeper. We've always known the African Union lacks backbone, but now it's undeniable. Yes, President Traoré welcomed the AU delegates with respect. He shook hands. He engaged in dialogue, but that doesn't erase the truth he's spoken before, truth that many African leaders are too afraid to say out loud. Traoré once blasted the AU in an interview that shook the continent. He didn't hold back. He pointed to the Congo, the heart of Africa, where children have been dying for years, a forgotten war, endless suffering. And what has the African Union done? Nothing. He mentioned Sudan, a nation torn apart. Still no real action from the AU, just empty statements and symbolic gestures. And then he turned to the Sahel, his home, his battlefield. For nearly 10 years, Traoré said, the Sahel has been the scene of international terrorism, but we see no support from these organizations to find a solution. His frustration wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was about a continent that's bleeding and an institution that looks the other way. Look around, from Mali to Niger, from the Democratic Republic of Congo to the Central African Republic, from Sudan to Libya. The map of Africa is dotted with conflict zones, places where war and terror have become a way of life. Even so-called stable countries aren't immune. Nigeria still battles Boko Haram. Ghana and Togo face creeping insecurity. No one is truly safe. Yet the African Union continues to act as if everything is under control, as if time will fix things. But time isn't healing Africa, it's hurting it. And leaders like Traoré are no longer willing to stay silent. For decades, conflict has raged across Africa, and yet not one regional bloc, not even the African Union, has been able to offer tangible, lasting support. They hold conferences, they issue statements, they talk, and then do nothing. It's pathetic. The truth is, countries like Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and the DRC have been left to fight alone, and with no other choice, they've turned to the West, inviting in foreign militaries in the hope that they might bring peace. But that hope has led nowhere. Today, the Sahel and other hotspots are filled with military footprints from the United States, France, Germany, even Russia. Troops armed with satellites, drones, and next-generation weapons. Surveillance capabilities that can detect movement from miles away. And yet, the insecurity has only grown worse. How is that possible? In many cases, the armed rebels and terrorist groups they're fighting are using outdated weapons, homemade explosives, rusty rifles, motorcycles, and still, year after year, these well-equipped foreign forces have failed to bring an end to the violence. Instead, civilians remain trapped in the middle, families torn apart, villages abandoned, schools shut down, markets turned into war zones. It's infuriating and heartbreaking. At this point, it's clear, these foreign militaries are not here to save Africa. If they were, the war would be over. So who will protect the continent? If the African Union can't rise to that challenge, if it can't provide real solutions, real strength, then what purpose does it serve? Africa's survival can't depend on outsiders, but it also can't rely on a passive, disconnected institution. Something has to change. This is why President Traoré didn't hold back in that interview. He wasn't just disappointed, he was outraged. He called out the African Union for its silence, not just in the face of regional insecurity, but in the face of outright injustice. When Western powers interfere in African affairs, when they fund rebellions, sponsor chaos, or support terrorist acts, where is the AU? Nowhere. Traoré gave a chilling example. He said, a few days ago, a foreign country openly announced that it had supported and participated in a cowardly terrorist and barbaric attack against the forces of our confederation. Yet, the African Union did not say a word to condemn this interference in the internal affairs of our state. Let that sink in. A foreign country admitted to backing a terrorist attack, and the African Union didn't even issue a statement. No condemnation, no emergency meeting, not even a whisper. Why? Because the African Union isn't free. It's not independent. It's financially shackled to the very powers it should be standing up against. Reports reveal that over 75% of the AU's funding comes from external partners, especially the European Union and countries like France. Think about that. How can an organization claim to represent Africa when most of its money comes from outside Africa? The AU was supposed to be a shield for the continent, a symbol of unity, strength, and sovereignty. But instead, it's been reduced to a quiet observer. too afraid to speak, too dependent to act. This isn't just a failure, it's a betrayal. And leaders like Traoré are finally saying what millions of Africans have felt for years. Let's be honest. If the roles were reversed, if Ukraine had backed an attack on a Western ally like France or Germany, there would be consequences. Retaliation, maybe even war. But when it happens to Mali, when African soldiers are targeted with foreign-backed violence, silence. Time and time again, the African Union has stood by, watching the West meddle in African affairs, fund rebellions, and exploit chaos. And each time, the AU does what it does best: nothing. President Traoré sees this clearly, and he's raising the alarm. In his interview, he didn't just voice disappointment. He made a call, a cry for action. "I would like them to hear this shout," he said, "and get out of their silence, so that the youth can believe in the African Union." But here's the painful truth. Will the AU ever take action? It's hard to believe. Just look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country gripped by war for decades. And when President Félix Tshisekedi was overwhelmed, did he turn to the AU? No, he turned to the United States. In desperation, he traded peace for promises, handing over access to Congo's vast natural resources. And the African Union? Completely absent. No involvement in the negotiations between the DRC and Rwanda. No presence in the talks with the M23 rebels. A continent in crisis, and its so-called guardian was missing. Isn't that shameful? What kind of future are we building when African problems are only solved through foreign intervention? If the African Union cannot even mediate peace between its own member states, if it cannot protect the dignity and sovereignty of African nations, then we have to ask, what is the African Union even for? Because right now, it's not representing Africa. And if nothing changes, then maybe it never will. When two Western nations have a dispute, they don't go to Africa or Asia to resolve it. They handle it within their own circle. Europe negotiates with Europe. America negotiates with America. But Africa still looks outward, still begs for solutions to its own problems from foreign powers. And that's the tragedy. We can't even mediate peace on our own continent. When the DRC sat down with the M23 rebels, when Rwanda came to the table, the African Union was nowhere to be seen. So let's be honest, if the AU couldn't show up for Congo, do we really believe it will show up for Burkina Faso, for Mali, for Niger, for the AES alliance? It's highly doubtful, and people are noticing. In recent years, the African Union has come under intense criticism, and for good reason. It's failing the very people it was created to serve. Let's rewind for a moment. The African Union was established in 2002, replacing the Organization of African Unity that was born back in 1963. Its mission was bold, powerful, inspiring. It was meant to foster unity, to build real cooperation between African states. Most importantly, it was created to promote peace, security, and stability across the continent. Because only in peace can Africa truly rise. Only in unity can we grow. But instead, the AU has become a ghost of that promise, a sleeping giant in a time of fire. And while its leaders sit in air-conditioned conference rooms, African children are dying in the Sahel. Communities are vanishing. Entire nations are left to fight alone. So here's the question we must all confront. Will the African Union finally wake up and become the force it was meant to be? Or will it remain just another failed promise, buried beneath the weight of silence? The African Union has always claimed it has the tools to build peace, and on paper, maybe it does. But in practice, it has failed. Repeatedly, the AU has shown flashes of potential. It has the structure, the influence, and the moral authority to respond to crises across the continent. But when Africa needed it most, it didn't act. Or worse, it acted too late. One of the AU's boldest promises came in the form of a dream. They called it silencing the guns by 2020. It was supposed to be the dawn of a new era, an Africa without war. But what happened? By 2020, Africa was drowning in bloodshed. Between 1990 and 2020, there were more than 656 armed conflicts across the continent. The guns weren't silenced. In many places, they were louder than ever. Still, in 2013, marking the 50th anniversary of the African Union's creation, African leaders gathered once again, and once again, they made a promise. This time, They pledged not to leave the burden of conflict to the next generation. They vowed that our children would grow up in peace. In 2016, they even launched a formal strategy, the Lusaka Roadmap, a detailed blueprint outlining 54 practical steps to end war and violence by 2020. It was ambitious, it was hopeful, and it addressed the real roots of Africa's problems, from funding the African Standby Force to cutting off rebel access to weapons, from fighting human trafficking and corruption to ending the money laundering that fuels war. Every step was carefully outlined. But once again, there was one thing missing: action. What's most ironic is that peacekeeping is supposed to be at the heart of the African Union's mission. It's the foundation of its very existence. The AU's Peace and Security Council was built on a powerful idea: African solutions for African problems. An idea that promised African nations would take responsibility for resolving their own conflicts. That peace would come not from outsiders, but from within. And in some moments, that vision came to life. In Liberia and Sierra Leone, during brutal civil wars, the AU stepped in. Peacekeeping forces were deployed, talks were brokered, stability slowly returned. In 2017, when Gambia faced a dangerous political crisis, the AU didn't sit on the sidelines. It joined ECOWAS in pressuring Yahya Jammeh to step down after losing an election. The threat of civil war was very real, and yet through coordinated diplomacy, disaster was averted. Moments like these prove one thing: the AU can act, it can make a difference. But sadly, these moments have been the exception, not the rule. For every Gambia, there's a DRC. For every Liberia, there's a Mali. The African Union's record is riddled with inconsistency. Nowhere is that more clear than in its biggest broken promise: silencing the guns by 2020. That was the dream, an Africa without war. But by the time 2020 arrived, that dream had collapsed. Instead of peace, Africa was gripped by some of its worst violence in decades. From 1990 to 2020, more than 656 armed conflicts had erupted across the continent. The guns weren't silenced, they were multiplied. So what happened? Was it a lack of resources? A lack of will? Or has the AU simply become too entangled in foreign dependence to stand on its own? These are the questions Africans are asking now, and they deserve answers. Because peace shouldn't be a fantasy, it should be a reality. And if the African Union won't lead us there, who will? In 2013, during the 50th anniversary of the African Union's founding, African leaders made a bold and emotional promise. They pledged to ensure sustainable and lasting peace across the continent. It was a powerful declaration, a commitment not to pass the burden of war and conflict onto the next generation of Africans. That promise was soon followed by the adoption of the Lusaka Roadmap in 2016, a detailed blueprint designed to silence the guns by the year 2020. The roadmap laid out 54 practical steps to bring an end to conflict. These steps focused on strengthening human security and ranged from adequately funding the African Standby Force for rapid deployment to cutting off arms supplies to rebels and insurgents. Other key points included tackling human trafficking, fighting corruption, and dismantling money laundering networks that fuel violence. On paper, it was everything Africa needed. But in reality, it was a dream too big for its timeline. From the very beginning, the 2020 deadline was unrealistic given the sheer number of active conflicts across the continent. Many of these conflicts were not just about external threats or foreign interference. They were rooted in deep internal grievances. Across Africa, countless uprisings have started not as wars, but as cries for help from citizens who felt unheard by their own governments. One powerful example is the Anglophone crisis in Cameroon. What began as peaceful protests by English-speaking communities demanding equality and representation was ignored. When the government responded with repression rather than dialogue, the situation spiraled into armed conflict. And throughout it all, the African Union remained silent. This is the fundamental flaw in the AU's peace efforts. You cannot silence the guns if you continue to ignore the voices that speak before they are forced to pick them up. Over Over the years, one thing has become painfully clear. The African Union has failed to live up to its promise as the solution to Africa's problems. Time and again, it has stood by as crises unfolded, unable or unwilling to intervene. Two of the most glaring examples of this failure were the conflicts in Côte d'Ivoire and Libya. Between 2010 and 2012, the crisis in Côte d'Ivoire spiraled into chaos. The AU had an opportunity to take a firm, unified stand, but it didn't. In the absence of decisive African leadership, France and the United Nations stepped in. The same story repeated in Libya in 2011. When violence broke out and civil war erupted, the African Union once again failed to act. And so, NATO, led by Western powers, intervened militarily. The result? A collapsed state, widespread instability, and a region flooded with weapons and extremist groups. And yet, even in the face of these failures, there are moments that prove the AU can be effective. As we've seen in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and the Gambia, when the AU chooses to act decisively, it can make a difference. It can prevent wars. It can protect democracy. That's what President Traoré is calling for. He isn't asking for miracles. He's demanding action. He's asking the AU to live up to its own ideals. But here's the hard truth. If the African Union continues to sit in silence, if it continues to avoid responsibility and defer to outsiders, then maybe it's time we ask the unthinkable. Should the African Union still exist? Because right now, for many Africans, it serves no real purpose. What do you think? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories and deep dives into African politics and leadership.